Now for 5 years or even longer, I've been closely monitoring the Oldschool Runescape market. I make market recaps every month, looking at some of the wildest price changes. So I thought it'd be interesting to look back throughout the entire history of the RuneScape market to find some of the single most wild price changes in this game. We're not talking about items that doubled or tripled in price, but items that went up 10 times in value, or even 100 times in value, or in some cases even more than that. Now, the first item I want to have a look at is going to require us to jump all the way back to the release of Chambers of Zaric. Now, the Chambers of Zaric was Oldschool RuneScape's first raid, and with it came a bunch of different items, and most of them followed a pretty common trajectory of being worth a ton the first couple weeks of them being released, and then slowly dropping over time. Giant price drops from newly released items are pretty common, and most of the Chambers of Zaric items followed this trajectory, except for one, and that was the Dragonetter crossbow. Just a month or two after the release of this item, it bottomed out at an all-time low of 23 mil. Extremely cheap for a pretty new item coming from the first raid. And I think Jagex might have thought the same thing because they made a few key changes that drastically altered the price of this item. On pretty well the anniversary of the item release, January 25th of 2018, they tripled the accuracy and damage bonus of this weapon versus dragons. It went from 10% to 30%. That on its own would have drastically increased the price, but they also released Dragon Slayer 2, which, as you know, came with the release of Vorkath. So not only did they drastically increase the power of this weapon, they also released the best consistent moneymaker of the last few years, which sent the price of this item into the stratosphere. The Dragonetter crossbow quickly tripled in price and continued to go up all the way until the end of the year, where it peaked at 173 mil, going up about 8 times in value in about a year. And even a half decade later, the Dragonetter is still worth 3 times more than it was pre-update. Now, if you want to look at a more modern example, you don't have to look much further than the Eldritch Orb. The Eldritch Orb has been on an absolutely wild ride ever since the end of 2022, so pretty recently. Now, similar to the release of most items, the Eldritch Orb peaked in the first couple weeks of the release and slowly lost its value over the next 2 years. This item started at about a half bill on the release and slowly fell to only a measly 36 mil. But something changed in the summer of 2022, and after the update, the Eldritch went from 50 mil up to 400 mil in just a few months, which is one of the biggest increases in modern Oldschool RuneScape. Now, this item's quick price increase really happened due to kind of a side effect from the Tombs of Amasket release in the summer. There's a few items that have indirectly affected it, primarily the Lightbearer, the Tunic and Shadow, and the Divine Rune Pouch. These 3 items have made the Eldritch Orb a lot more commonly used at places like the Inferno primarily. Nowadays, you can bring the Eldritch Orb as a spec weapon thanks to the extra inventory slot you get from the 4-slot Rune Pouch. Not to mention it's now a viable spec weapon at more content thanks to the Tunic and Shadow and the Lightbearer. Now, another interesting item is gotta be the Christmas Cracker. The Christmas Cracker in Old School has historically been worth almost nothing. They drop it seasonally every year, but beyond that, there actually is no way to get it in game. They drop a ton of them, but there is a limit to how many are in the game at one time. Now, if you look at the end of 2021, something really weird happened. Christmas crackers started going up a bit, and then by next year, they went up a tremendous amount, going from an all-time low of only 5,000 to a high of nearly 400k, which is nearly a 100 times increase. Now, games of chance aren't allowed in Old School RuneScape, and for quite a while, most items that have a random effect have been removed. Stuff like flowers no longer give random flowers, and other items like it, but there's actually one item left in the game that produced a somewhat random effect, that being a Christmas cracker. Each time you pulled one, you'd get a random party hat plus some other items, and due to this, Christmas crackers actually became an item used by dicers and gamblers in modern RuneScape, and that's mainly what drove the price up to such catastrophic levels. Of course, there's somewhat of a cap on what gamblers would be willing to pay to do a single roll, but even today, they're still worth over 100,000 each, which is incredible. Now, the Oldschool Runescape market can be extremely volatile, which means it's, sometimes nice to have some consistency in your life. Factor 75 is by far the most consistent way to have a good meal at home, which is today's video sponsor. Yesterday, I spent 2 hours doing Rogue's Den, which means I'm pretty stressed out. And the last thing I want to do is cook, but thanks to Factor, having a healthy meal at home is super easy. They send completely ready-made meals right to your house. All you have to do is heat them up and you're ready to eat. This honestly saves me so much time, and compared to takeout, it's way healthier and cheaper too. Factor meals start as low as only $11 per meal, and with Factor you can completely customize your diet. They have an absolutely huge menu every week, from things like filet mignon, to Thai curries, to biryani, to things I'm not even sure what they are. And right now, thanks to Factor's partnership with my channel, they are currently offering a massive discount to those of you who want to try it. You simply have to click the link in my description and enter the code POGOLDSCHOOLMAY40 to get a 40% discount plus 20% off your next month. So I would definitely recommend trying it out, and thanks to Factor for sponsoring the video. Now, probably the item in Oldschool RuneScape that has seen the biggest price increase ever historically, at least when it comes to the straight up value, is gotta be the Third Age pickaxe. It's not even close. Now, the entire Third Age market in general saw a giant boom in 2020. Now, in my opinion, that was mainly driven by the fact that at that point, there hadn't been any new items, new rare, expensive items to buy. There was a bit of a content drought when it came to PVM or other content that were released shiny new items. So more and more gold was stacking up, and people had nothing to do with it, so they just spent it on rare items that just quickly inflated their price. Now, the Third Age pickaxe in particular was the most greatly affected because it is one of the most difficult pieces of Third Age to obtain. You can only get it from Master Clue Scrolls, and an additional factor is you actually use pickaxes in kind of high-end pieces of content, like Chambers of Zaric, for example, which means it's somewhat of a status symbol as well. When the Third Age pickaxe released, it came out at about a price of 300 mil. Still an expensive item, and it did slowly increase. By 2019, it was worth around 600 mil, but it just continued to go up and up and up, and by 2020, it hit the maximum sellable cash amount of 2.1 bill in the Grand Exchange. As of today, we don't know 100% what it's worth, but I am gonna hazard a guess around 4 bill. Or at least it has been worth 4 bill in the past. So over a 10 times increase for an item that was already extremely expensive. Even today, the Third Age pickaxe is the only item that is sellable in the Grand Exchange that is worth over a max cash stack, making it pretty unique. Now, although there has been incredible price increases on a variety of different items throughout the years, it's time to have a look at the opposite here. One of the most catastrophic price crashes in the history of the OSRS market. Now, let's start with somewhat of a benign item. It didn't really matter that it crashed that much, unless you happen to have tons of these, which I guess some people did. Now, the item I'm talking about is kind of a category, and that is Ancient Teleport Tablets. Going into 2020, things like the Granite Teleport Tablet, Zar Teleport Tablet, these were only obtainable from the Last Man Standing shop, so they're actually quite rare, and at the end of the year, some of them were worth about 20,000 each. But literally days later, they crashed by over 20 times in value, down to only 1,000 each. So what happened? Well, Jagex made these craftable, which means they went from being kind of a rare item only obtainable from a PvP minigame to literally anyone can make them if you have some crafting levels. They dropped so quickly in price that players were sacrificing these to Death's Coffer to get over 20 times more in value than what they actually paid, and Jagex actually had to step in and manually decrease the item on the Grand Exchange to stop people abusing it. Now, the PVM item that I think takes the cake for the largest increase by percentage ever in the history of this game has to go to the Granite Boots. Now, Granite Boots were released alongside the Fossil Island update and are only dropped by Fossil Island Wyverns, and they're pretty rare at that. Now, on top of them being a rare item, they are also not very useful. These two factors together you'll see is a common theme when it comes to vast price increases. So once again, maybe Jagex thought, hey, these aren't very useful, let's make them useful in a new piece of content. Well, that piece of content came with the Kebos Lowlands update at the beginning of 2019. Now, Jagex decided to make Granite Boots protect you from the extremely hot ground in the Karum Slayer dungeon, making them the only boots you could wear there that would give you a strength bonus. So for killing things like the alchemical hydra, regular hydras, worms, anything else in the Slayer dungeon, if you wanted to use melee, you probably wanted to use Granite Boots. Now before this update, Granite Boots were only worth about 100,000 gold each, and due to this update and the hype before it, they surged up to a whopping 7 mil, which is a 70 times increase, which is insane for a PVM item. And even today, they are worth nearly a mil. Now, although there were many items in 2022 that were affected by the Tombs of Amascut, the one that probably was affected the most negatively, at least price-wise, was the Harmonized Orb. The Harmonized Orb, until very recently, was one of the most expensive items in the entire game. While it was niche, it did have its uses and excelled at those locations. And leading up to the Tombs of Amascut, people were hopeful that the Harmonized Orb would be useful within the raid, and that hope was absolutely misplaced, because as soon as TOA was released, the item went from about 750 mil down to under 300, losing nearly 500 mil just in about a month. One of the quickest price drops of an expensive rare item I've ever seen, and it was almost entirely due to the Tumican Shadow, which just outclassed it at the vast majority of content throughout Gielinor. Rest in peace, Harmonized Orb. Now, one item that has seen a surprisingly large price increase in the last 5 years has to be the Bandos Godsword. For those who didn't play Oldschool Runescape prior to 2018, you might not remember that the Bandos Godsword was actually a very cheap item. Ever since its release, it was hovering somewhere between 5 mil and as low as 2.5 mil. Now, although it is a very powerful weapon, it was hampered by one main factor. When it was released, the special attack required 100% of your special attack energy, which was really significant. Now, although they did reduce it in 2015, it still didn't really change much about how you would actually use it. So Jagex decided November 9th of 2017, let's reduce the special attack energy to 50%. This is really notable because now you could use 2 special attacks in one sequence. This change immediately doubled its price, but it wasn't done there. Throughout 2018, it increased to 10 mil and then 13 mil, where it stayed that way for a long time. Now by the time the Tombs of Amascut rolled around, the Bandos Godsword peaked at an all-time high of nearly 25 mil. Which is over a 10 times increase, which is quite a journey for what used to be a very cheap spec weapon. Now, you can't rightly make a video about absurd price changes without talking about the Zelandra Teleport. This is probably the most infamous case of a wild price change, and it occurred back in 2015. Now, Zelandra Teleports are dropped by Zulrah, but on release, they were dropped in absurdly high amounts. Each time you roll a drop, you would get 50 Zelandra Teleports, which is kind of insane. Now in January of 2015, they did change it down to 20, but that didn't really change much at all. There was still a vast surplus of Zelandra Teleports. So in October of 2015, Jagex took the nuclear option of decreasing them from 20 to 1. This drastically reduced the amount of Zelandra Teleports that were coming into the game, and they went from a measly price of 100 GP up to a peak of 55,000. Which is a 550 times increase, the biggest on record that I can think of anyway. Now, Jagex continued to refine these numbers throughout the years, but it still remains one of the more questionable but explosive price changes in the history of Oldschool. Now, for those who don't remember, the Elysian Spirit Shield used to actually be much cheaper. If you were transported back 6 years ago today, the Elysian would be worth only about 280 mil. But since then, the Elysian kept creeping up in price. Throughout the years, it would just consistently go up a couple mil every week or two, until eventually it reached the 1 billion GP mark, even going as high as 1.2 bill at the end of 2021. For such a niche item, the Elysian really increased a lot. And I think the primary reason is actually the Inferno. The Inferno was released June of 2017, and that's really when the item started to go up a lot. The Elysian is quite useful in the Inferno, as it allows you to make more mistakes than if you don't have the Elysian and reduces a ton of oncoming damage. And as far as I'm aware, that's the only piece of content that caused this price increase. Kind of crazy. Now, another item that went completely ballistic just for like a month or two are the Ranger Gloves. Now for some reason, back when the Theater of Blood was being developed, Jagex thought it would be a good idea to have the Ranger gloves be a precursor item to upgrade into the new Vampirium bracers, which would be best in slot range gloves. Now in theory, this mechanic isn't a bad one, but taking an item that is only obtainable from a clue scroll and having it turn into a best in slot item is absurd. Imagine if they took the 3rd Age longsword and said, you need this to upgrade into the best in slot new melee weapon. It would just be insane. But because they were planning on doing this, the Ranger gloves increased from 3 mil up to 30 mil in a very, very short period of time. Of course, they decided not to do that, and they immediately tumbled back down again, but over a 10 times increase in just a month, purely due to speculation. And the final item that I think fits the bill here requires us to go all the way back to the Zulrah release. Now the Zulrah items shortly after the boss's release actually weren't worth very much. A few months later, and the Serpentine Visage, the Magic Fang, etc. were only worth a few 100,000 gold each, and were plummeting very, very quickly. This is mainly due to the fact that Zulrah just absolutely pumps out alchable items, resource items. That's mostly why people kill the boss, which means the uniques were not holding any value. So Jagex decided we need to fix this, and they made a change, and this change allowed you to dismantle Zulrah uniques into 20,000 Zulrah scales. This immediately shot up the value of these items by about 20 times. They went from 200k each to 5 mil over the next year or two, and because they're bound to the price of Zulrah scales, they're always going to have a pretty significant value. So that's it guys, those are some of the craziest price changes in RuneScape history. Let me know down below if you can think of anything else, but those are my fan favorite top picks. Thanks for watching as always guys, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Now before I go here, I want to give a giant thank you to all of my members over on YouTube. Thank you so much to Alejandra, Mitch Reinders, The Hybrid, and Kush Patel for all being subscribed at the Dragon tier. You guys are awesome. I do really appreciate it. Also thank you to Kapersky, YoYoSub89, and NDM0001 for being subscribed at the Runite tier. Thanks everyone again, and I'll see you next time.